Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll start the webinar in another 2 minutes as we wait for more attendees to join. Thank you. Okay, so a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We have people joined, all over the world today. We're ready to start this webinar, and I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope all of you and your families are safe. We have a chat box available here. So if you all have any questions, please feel free to send us your questions and we'll cover them during the end of the webinar. Okay, so I've been joined today by some of our industry expert, starting from Landy, who's really with us from China. She's working as a senior manager with the Excelia Group. She's an expert on the revenue management side. They almost have about 90% of Chinese airlines as their customers. Then we have Payal Bedi, who's joined us from India. She works as the head of route revenue team at AirAsia. She's been definitely associated with the revenue management function from years now. She's worked with Indigo in the past, and her expertise is really route revenue management, network optimization, and ancillary revenue strategies. Then I'm joined by Oksana from Russia. Oksana is in the revenue management team at UTair. She's been working with them for almost 5 years now. She's here to share her experience with us that how regional carriers in Europe should be dealing with the situation. Then we have, Arvind with us as well. So Arvind is the associate partner at Lufthansa Consulting. He has a wide aviation and management consulting experience background. He's worked all over the world, likes of Europe, Asia, North America. His key areas of expertise include airline strategy, network, fleet management, and transformation. Then we are also joined by Nadine from Lufthansa Consulting as well. Nadine has, significant expertise across different commercial functions, revenue management, pricing, customer experience. So she'll be talking mostly on the commercial side of business and would share her experience and insights with us. And last but not the least, I'm your moderator today, Shweta Vashisht, Vice President Sales at TradeGain. We are a leading provider of SaaS products. We provide revenue maximization solutions to the travel and hospitality industry. We work with the top 25 out of 30 OTAs in the world. We work with top 23 out of 30 hotel chains. We work with a lot of airlines, top car rental companies, cruises, as well as the largest corporate travel providers. So as we really begin this webinar, first of all, I would like to thank all our panelists today for coming together to contribute to this Great Gains Better Tomorrow initiative. So this initiative is more around helping travel professionals like yourself get insights on how they can cope up, with the current pandemic, and also look at the insights which can help you guys stay optimistic about the recovery as well. As we know, we're joined by the industry experts here from China, India, Europe to help all of us share some of the insights and also share their personal learnings. How can the industry get prepared for day one of the new normal, which is a big question these days, which everyone has? And what are the right questions to ask yourself as you approach day one? To answer these fundamental questions, we'll go through four tracks during this webinar. Starting from the recovery in China, Landy will be sharing some interesting insights with us. Then moving on to Payal, who will be sharing with us and discussing how route planners should change their approach, as well as important questions which we should be asking before preparing for day one. We'll be then moving on to a quick Q&A session with Oksana, who's joining us from Russia, on how European revenue management teams are changing, looking at the situation. And finally, we'll be talking about, with Lufthansa Consulting, what the day one in the new normal would look like. So, Landy, really coming to you, I understand that you have some interesting takeaways to share with all of us from the Far East, which could help all the attendees in Europe who are just starting their day feel better and positive. This is not the first time or first crisis China has faced in this century. So, my first question to you, Landy, is how do you think the recovery of COVID-19 will be as compared to the previous epidemics like SARS? Landy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you for the introduction, Shraddha.
Sure.
First of all, let's look back in the history. So I'm going to show you a graph shows the impact of the SARS on the passenger numbers in domestic China and the APAC region. They are being shown in two dashed lines, you can see here. The horizontal axis represents the months before and after the pandemic outbreak. The red dashed line shows the impact of the China domestic passenger numbers. We can see after 3 months of the SARS outbreak, it hit the bottom, but also bounced back pretty quickly and strongly. So 3 months later, the traffic was back to normal. In summary, it was a V-shape for SARS impact. Now let's look at the COVID-19 impact on domestic China. Where is the solid red line? It only took 1 month to hit the bottom and start to recover in the domestic market. At that time, we made expectations based on 2 scenarios. The scenario 1 is it will continue like V-shape. Could you jump to the next slide? Yeah, so the scenario 1 is like a V-shape, and the scenario 2 is more like a U-shape. So it takes longer time to recovery. So what does it really look in reality? So I'm going to show you some domestic China's we collect, domestic data we collect from China. Shall we go to the next slide? Shraddha, could you help me to show the data on the next slide? Yes.
Yes.
So this slide actually shows the 3 phases in China. So the first phase is the decline phase, which is 2 weeks after the outbreak. The second phase is another 2 weeks, which is the bottom phase, when the numbers of the active cases hit in the peak. So in the background of this graph, I'm showing the active cases in the gray columns. So you can see here they are hitting the peak and then start to decline. While the active cases start to decline, the capacities and the booking numbers start to grow gradually. So that's the third phase of recovery. However, what surprised us is that outbreaks start to happen outside of China, in other regions. So it made the situation more unpredictable. So the curves reflect with more flat and longer slopes. But overall, the domestic traffic in China is slowly recovering both capacity and booking numbers are growing.
Sure. This definitely looks good, and good news for us, Landy. Thank you so much for sharing that. And if we go a level down and look at the domestic versus international markets, or if we look at business versus leisure markets, how do you feel the recovery is planned for that? This is especially important for European airlines who look to prepare for this recovery in the near future.
Okay, so we can break down the China market into domestic, international, and regional. So
Sure.
here you can clearly see that the three lines represent the domestic, international, and regional. Regional is the traffic among mainland Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. It's very clear that domestic recovery faster than international regional markets.
Sure.
This is driving by the fast and effective pandemic control in mainland. And as for the comparison between business market and leisure markets, we calculated the percentage of the capacity in three phases against the peak time.
Yeah.
Which I will show you in next slide. Could you help me show the data on the next slide? So this first table is showing who are the fastest, who are growing in the fastest way in respective of the capacity.
Yeah.
And we can see most of them are business market or the mixed markets. And there are also some hubs I'm using underline them. They are the province capitals, so they are recovering faster. Sure. And our data also shows after the control measures were lifted, there were around 25% of demand erupt immediately for the business market.
Sure, and absolutely.
The next table on the right side, it will show some regulations on the big international transportation hubs. They are recovering more slowly due to strict restrictions, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangdong.
Right.
For example, people who come to Beijing requires 14 days quarantines, and any traveler wish to stay in a Beijing hotel requires a COVID-19 negative testing report.
Right.
So those regulations are not only impacting the big transportation hubs, but also on the leisure markets. So that's why we can see in the last table, it shows the leisure markets are recovering slower due to regulations. This is from the capacity perspective. And now let's check out the fares. So the top two snapshots shows the fare trends from the business market, and the bottom two are from the leisure market. We can see the fares in the business market are recovering faster than the leisure market with a higher increase rate. For the leisure markets, there is a fare increase around early May. That is because there is a 5-day holiday in China. After the holiday, the fares drop back to a lower level. So overall, the domestic recovery faster than international markets, and the business market recovery faster than leisure markets.
Awesome, awesome. I'm sure the recovery of different markets would help our colleagues from different parts of the world. Landy, if you can also throw some light on what actually worked for airlines in China. Which airlines saw a faster recovery or are seeing a faster recovery? Is it low-cost airlines or full service carriers? If you can talk more about that as well.
Sure. So based on my observations, there are three major measures that Chinese airlines are taking.
Sure.
The first one is unlocking cash. So some airlines are starting to sell coupons for future flights, which means if a customer buys a coupon right now, he or she can redeem it in the future.
Sure.
Additionally, we as Acelia are also providing the payment solutions for airlines. And we have noticed that airlines are clearing their backlog for the credit card billings and ATMs to unlock cash. And the second measure is cost control.
Right.
Airlines are estimating their marginal cost and marginal revenue. If the marginal contribution is negative, they will consider canceling or combine the flights. However, some airlines are under a big pressure of cash flow, so they could still operate the flights if they are in a negative contribution. So it's up to airlines' judgment based on the situation. ICD are also helping airlines to check the BIDT files to prevent GDS cost leakage. Last but not least, a lot of airlines are converting their passenger flights to freighters. With less passenger flights operated, the cargo capacity from passenger flights decreased, but the demand for cargo is increasing, especially for the critical medical resources. So the conversion also got support from our government. In the first quarter of China, the passenger number dropped to 55%, but the cargo actually increased 28%.
Absolutely.
So these are some measures taken in China. As regarding of your question between the low-cost carrier and the full-service carrier, I can show you a graph to show the year-over-year capacity trend among 5 airlines in China.
Sure, that would be awesome.
So in general, if you can show the slides. Yeah, in general, we can see that the 3 large legacy airlines, which is Air China, Air Southern, and Air Eastern, they are recovering more slowly because they have a big portion of international flights, and their hubs are under strict regulations. So here you can see the China Express Airlines recovering faster. They are regional airlines. I think the faster recovery is due to 2 reasons. The first, they focus on the domestic market. Second, they have a high proportion of uniquely operated routes, so no competition. Another airline here is recovering very fast is Spring Airline, which is the largest low-cost carrier in China. I think there are 4 reasons for their fast recovery. First is they have the high proportion of the mainland routes. Second, they suspended less flights during the pandemic peak as they have lower costs. Third, the Spring Airlines prepared more emergency cash reserves. Last, the decline in oil price also further accelerated the recovery of Spring Airline. So overall, if the pandemic can get good control in one country, the regional airlines and low-cost carriers can have good potentials for fast recovery.
Awesome. This is some awesome data here. And, Landy, if you can show us some examples on how Chinese airlines actually changed their business models to generate more demand in this situation. Do you have anything to show around that?
Sure. As I mentioned that the Spring Airline was recovering very fast.
Yeah.
Another reason for them is they had initiated, they have started a marketing campaign with some other airlines. So this is a poster from Spring Airlines. They are promoting charter flights to support work resumption. The demand for charter flights mainly from the government and the big corporates who wish their employees to get back to work faster and safer. So they choose charter flights. For example, for China Southern Airlines, they have operated more than 100 charter flights during the pandemic time. So the first demand wave we can expect it during the recovery is a demand for charter flights.
Sure.
So around the end of February, I think almost all Chinese airlines are promoting customized charter flights. And I have another poster from the faster recovery in China Express Airlines. This poster is for individual passengers. The slogan is "Fly at ease." So they are promoting 4 protections. First, all passengers get COVID-19 insurance when flying with China Express. Second, they vacate the middle seats to ensure social distancing on plane.
Right.
Third, they have temperature check and gate, so the passengers won't be flying with people who have fever.
Sure.
Lastly, they ensure disinfected cabin and contactless in-flight service. So those are some marketing ideas that Chinese airlines have taken during the pandemic.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Landy. And Landy, we've been reading a lot that airlines has to go through a lot of refund process because of the situation, and I'm sure you guys would have gone through it as well in that particular market. So, is there any trend, or if you can share with the group here, how long did it take? For the Chinese market to recover such situation where you would see a positive impact on the sales versus the refund, which we've been doing from long now.
Yeah, sure. So as they are process payment transaction across the global for many airlines. So
Yeah.
we have a large data pool to generate statistics on the payments. As you can see in this graph, because of the high volume of cancellations, for today we have seen the refund exist sales for the first time in airline history. However, if we take closer look at by region, we can see some light at the end of the tunnel from APAC.
Sure.
So you can see in the APAC region for the next slide that
Right.
the sales exist the refunds again in early April. And this is mainly driven by the domestic China market. So of course, it will get back to recovery soon. So lastly, I want to show you a picture I took from my window to prove it. So on this slide, I can see the traffic is returning from my window in Beijing. Yeah. So
That's
I'm sure.
view.
Yes, looks
I'm
very
sure
promising.
I'm sure everyone's dying to see this view from their windows as well.
I know. So I'm sure the traffic will be returning to the air soon. And I know you must be meeting the traffic jams. So no worries. They will come back soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think Payal has a question for Landy.
So, hi, Landy, and thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. The story is really comforting, especially for us in India, given that we are, at the in the middle of the crisis right now. What I find interesting is that I think one of the airlines is advertising middle seat vacant. It has cost implications, and I wanted to understand how did the airlines cater to the increase in cost per seat, because from your earlier charts I can see that the fares were not that great. So what were the cost implications of offering vacant middle seats?
Okay, thank you for the question. So this policy was executed during the seat assignment. So when they assign seats, they can ensure that middle seat is keep acting. And because it's during the pandemic peak time, the load factor was very low anyway. So it's pretty easy to vacant middle seat to ensure social distancing on plane. But during the recovery time, the load factor is increasing. So the vacant middle seat cannot be guaranteed offer to all the passengers. So what airlines are doing is they will give passengers a coupon for compensation if they don't get empty middle seat. So the passengers will feel good as the coupons are free anyway. So these coupons also help bring back more future sales for the airline. So in total, I feel this policy is good for marketing, good for sales, and good for customer experience. So that's how I feel it's really a good idea during the pandemic.
Thanks, Landy.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I think Arvind also has a question for Landy.
Yes, thanks, Shweta. Landy, it was quite interesting to see the yield information as well that you shared, especially business versus leisure. I understand that was for a particular time period, but if you look a little bit further, does the data tell you anything about whether yields are likely to come back to pre-crisis levels, or are airlines just keeping yields low in the interest of pumping up load factors?
Okay, thank you for the question. So during the pandemic peak time, the fares were very low in general, and there were even $10 flight ticket, cheaper than the bus ticket. That is because some airlines are under big pressure of the cash flow. During the recovery, the fares are start to growing back, but it's nowhere near last year's performance, of course. So from my point of view, at this time, fear is not the only thing or only factor to drive the load factors. Normally, customers' behavior is based on their perceived value. So before the pandemic, the perceived values are trade-offs among price, time, and convenience. So right now, the perceived values could also include the government regulation, the risk of infection. Those factors are also impacting the customer behavior and the fly load factor. So for example, people right now prefer to move from a high infected area to less infected area. So the outbound fare could be high, but the inbound fare could be low. So I think it's very important time for airlines to evaluate the markets on a micro market level based on the useful data and information, so that airlines can better predict the demand and act proactively in the micro market level.
Thanks, Landy.
Thank you.
Great. I think thank you, Landy. These are some of the good examples which you quoted. I even got a comment that I shouldn't be interrupting you by saying sure, but that's fine. This actually shows that the audience is really loving the session. So thank you so much. I mean, this was really interesting, and I loved the advertisement on the vacant middle seat there. Now, I wanted to ask Payal, who's really tied up these days as India looks at relaxing lockdown measures early May. Talk about on the challenges and what can a revenue manager or a route planning professional do as airlines look at resuming operations, within the constraints of social distancing, which Landy as well mentioned.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here today.
Sure.
I think the biggest challenge that network planners and route planners are facing today is uncertainty. I don't think anyone has, seen a crisis like this before. And even the past references, do not do justice to the quantum of the crisis that we are facing right now. A few key questions that I think everyone is asking. One of them being, what's the crisis timeline going to be? The questions that people are asking is whether it gets resolved in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or we're talking about a recovery till 21. I think that's the biggest question that is, that's on the mind of network planners and route planners. After that, I think the biggest question is, as the recovery happens, what kind of capacity to operate? Should we get back to, operating our full capacity? Like, some of the, we could see some of the players in China have done, or take a gradual approach where we, start with 80%, 60% or 40% capacity. That's the next question that, people are trying to find answers to. The third question is demand. I think once we realize what kind of capacity we want to enter with, a question that is related to it is, where is the next set of demand going to originate from? Is it going to be a traditional, metro stations, or it's going to be new cities connecting together? How do we identify these new pocket of demands? And the last one, okay. Just a sec. I'm so sorry, there's a lag with the presentation. Okay. I think the last one that everyone also is trying to understand is there going to be a fundamental shift in the customer behavior? Are we dealing with the same passenger or the same passenger profile or the same need for travel? Or there is going to be a new set of, or travel as a process is going to be redefined for, our consumers. So starting with crisis timeline, I think the biggest question, like I said, is on whether it's a 3-month recovery, 6-month recovery, 12-month recovery period that we are looking at. The next question is it going to be a immediate rebound, a V-shaped rebound, or it's going to be a gradual recovery, which means we need to plan only for a gradual plan for a month or 2 months, or it has to be a full-fledged plan for the year, planning a gradual recovery, or it's going to be a L-shaped recovery, which means that the entire setup of the industry is going to change. Fundamentally, we are going to see a shift in what the demand is going to be. If you think about it, India has been bullish. Like if you think about Indian operators, they have been very bullish on growth, even as far as domestic network is concerned and international footprint. A lot of our, Indian operators have in the past started focusing a lot more on international expansion. So for them, I think the next question is domestic versus international recovery, because it will definitely have an impact on their capacity plan and their demand plan for the year. I think the answer to this is that I don't think anyone knows the correct answer right now. No one sitting today can predict whether it's going to be a 3-month or a 6-month recovery. So please work with multiple scenarios. I think all route planners have to look at multiple scenarios to work with. Have a plan for each of the cases, and there is refer to the data. I would suggest that don't blindly make plans, but refer to the data. You know what's happening in your geography where you're operating. There are there's a lot of information around the number of cases, the degree of crisis. uh, Actively follow what the government is doing, what the state government is doing, and the actions that central government is taking, because that will give you some level of view of what's happening, or where the crisis is moving towards. And I would say have a plan for each of the scenarios. You need to have a plan for each of the scenarios. You cannot afford to just have one plan. Unfortunately, with the rate at which this is moving, it is important to be prepared and revisit these scenarios. Like I said, things are moving very fast. So the scenarios will also change. So there is a constant need to revisit your scenarios, add more information to it, and come back and plan again. In one of the studies that I was going through, I found this chart and I found it very interesting, where one of the consulting firms has gone ahead and put a few crises, few scenarios, and they go ahead and they talk about how to plan for a few of these scenarios. And if you can see, you have multiple scenarios saying what kind of rebound it will be and what the time period would be, and based on the current information that's available, which are the most likely scenarios. And I think that's the kind of approach that everyone needs to move towards. Instead of having one fixed plan, have multiple scenario plans. I think that's the first part of the problem. The other is, how do we figure out what to fly and where to fly? What I think as revenue managers, we need to question is whether our current understanding of demand is relevant anymore. The current variables around which you slice your demand is, say, seasonality. So in India, for example, May and June is supposed to be a peak period, but clearly that's not going to be the case. Then there is time of day seasonal, demand patterns driven by corporate and leisure travel and routes. Then there's day of week, and then there are special events. I think for the next 2-3 months, all revenue managers and route planners should take a step back and question whether these traditional cuts that we've been so used to, and there is a sort of bias that gets created in our minds as well. I think that we need to make an exceptional effort to question these and try and figure out whether they hold true in the new normal. Again, a data centric approach would be the best way to go forward. You need to look at information that's available within your ecosystem. So your forward bookings can be an indicator. Then you can look at what your forecasting models have been predicting. I think there is a big caveat there, that you really need to see whether your forecasting models are relevant or not, whether they need to be tweaked further, or you need to change the way your data weightages are there on the forecasting model. That's something that you have to do. Again, track what the local development is. Based on a pre-lockdown experience, the demand, you will see demand pick up in 2-3 hours. So you do not have the luxury to wait for for a week to pick up on demand. There is going to be a more frequent uh, uh, variability in demand, and that's what your revenue analysts need to be on top of. And the last one would be closely monitor your competition, because that can also be an early indicator of what is happening in the market. So that would be my advice on what to do as far as identifying the next pocket of opportunity as far as demand is concerned. um, I think once all of this is done, the next is that how do you plan? Like, if everything is moving so fast, how do you plan for this level of variability? And I think the key to that is we have to change the way we have been managing network planning. Network planning for most of the airlines is an exercise which is done 4 to 8 times a day, sorry, a year. So what you basically do is you file your schedule during season changes, and then you revisit them during the ongoing season, and you usually give route a little time to pick up before you decide whether it's working or not. So that's the general process of network optimization. I think given the current scenario, that needs to change, which means you might be optimizing your network on a weekly basis, which will pose, challenges which you haven't faced, or the network planners would have not faced before. Usually, you get time to validate the schedule, run past through crewing teams, get slot approvals, and have a full-fledged plan it with operations. Your rosters are published a month in advance. All of that needs to be rechecked, which means not only your commercial departments, but your operational departments, OCC, ground ops, everyone has to take a step back and see how this nimbleness that is required in the system is going to impact their operations, and what are the new processes that you have to put in place to be able to achieve this nimbleness. So there has to be a lot more agility as far as planning is concerned. You cannot go back to that 4 to 8 times a year planning.
Right, right. And as we talk about the changes in the traditional practices of route planning, Payal, do you also believe that in the new normal, airline commercial teams will be the most impacted because of the consumer behavior changes? I mean, we have a question from one of the attendees as well around this. Would there be a need to relook at what metrics should they chase to define success?
I think there is definitely going to be a shift in the consumer behavior, and I think a lot of us are already seeing that. If you think about it, the question that the industry is also debating is the shift going to be temporary. Where people are a little skeptical about traveling, there is concerns around travel, or it's going to be a fundamental change in the way people work, so which may end up impacting travel. So I mean, this crisis is going to redefine traveling to some extent, driven by customer behavior. I think one of the key things that we are seeing right now in consumers is they are looking for more certainty in plan, which means people are not booking their tickets 90 days in advance. They're booking more closer to departure. So they really need that certainty. So either you can wait for them to book closer to departure, which means your planning process is going to move closer to departure, or can you introduce products which give them that comfort that even if they have booked today, they have the flexibility to reschedule later. So I think that is one of the key themes that we are seeing. There's more certainty in planning that people are looking for. The other thing is the need to travel. Like, are we going to see more discretionary travel, or people are going to, travel only when it is required? Which means, will putting a sale fare of 1,000 rupees actually stimulate demand? Because if people are only traveling when there's a need to travel, then there is going to be a fundamental change in price elasticity. And I think that's a big question for the revenue managers to ask: what's the true price elasticity of the consumer in these times? The next is, and I think Landy had also covered, that in terms of the advertising, people need to be more comfortable with flying. So how do airlines make people more comfortable? Do they put some products out there, or how do they, advertise what initiatives they are taking? Because a lot of airlines are, right now taking multiple initiatives around plane cleaning, around ensuring there is, some level of distancing maintained. And how do we make the consumer aware of these initiatives that the airlines are taking, and make them more comfortable with flying? I think the next question, which comes back to roots, is what kind of travel is going to take up first? Will people will be traveling only for business, or will people will be traveling for leisure? It will have a lot of impact on what kind of routes will pick up, what kind of time slots will pick up, and you know basically, again, on your booking curve also. So I think that there will be a fundamental change in the way consumer is making purchases. The question is whether it's going to be temporary or permanent, and I think that's what the revenue managers need to continuously question. Like, is this change going to stay, or it's only a transiting change?
Thank you, Payal. Looking at the time, I would thank you so much. I think the questions which you have answered, would really help all the revenue managers on the call to plan accordingly for the recovery. I would
Yeah.
actually like to, ask Oksana now, who joins us from UTAIR from Russia. Oksana, what revenue managers should do to prepare when it comes to regional European carriers? While we have discussed regional carriers within Asia, we understand that Europe, regional carriers are a different market. So according to you, what kind of changes will the regional carriers in Europe are experiencing in the revenue management function?
Um, Hello, everybody. Thank you, Shweta, for that question. Obviously, pandemic have a severe impact on airlines, and regional airlines are in the group of high risk. Big global companies may rely on the government help, but regional is absolutely not the story. It is impossible to help everybody from the view of government, and most regional airlines don't own their planes, and it is impossible to get the loans from the banks. If this sector, as a sector of regional airlines, will be wiped out of the crisis, that leave hundreds of smaller cities served only by regional jets with very limited air service, or perhaps not at all. I think you know this sad historical pattern that when there is a downturn, the smaller communities are the ones that lose service first. The next, I would like to highlight the main points which regional airlines are recommended to pay attention more than usual. The first is to adjust seat availability to gain maximum revenue. Very important now to have a strategy and clear company goals, for example, to cover variable costs, and react immediately in case if these goals do not seem to be achievable. Now we don't have a lot of time to think, unfortunately. The second issue is to put revenue management systems optimization process on a pause. Now we couldn't rely on forecasting models based on previous departure data. Manual availability adjustments save us from using outdated information. The third is to improve cancellation algorithms. Airlines should follow strict order of rules that save them from money loss caused by yield or load factor, low yield or load factor flights. And the last point here is to monitor and adjust forecast for a long-term period. Beyond the next 1 or 2 months, there is significant uncertainty. Taking the right steps will maintain previously observed levels. If seasonality will have been preserved, may use the seasonal periods as a guideline. Adjust demand to expected volumes and monitor carefully future departure dates for deviation from the expected numbers. When we are not sure about forecast, it is especially valuable watching how booking are coming and understanding what is the expectations is. So it is necessary to monitor how booking are coming in relative to what our expectations is. And of course, for a long range period, we start working with network planning and marketing to start getting the picture of how do you expect your individual markets to rebound as schedule will get back to normal. So I think that's the 4 key points for especially regional airlines. So thank you, Sveta.
Sure. Thank you, Oksana. That was really helpful. And what, according to you, should the revenue managers in Europe be doing today to prepare for the day one of the new normal? Like, quickly, if you can talk about it before I discuss further with Arvind and Nadine.
Okay, thank you. I think that revenue management is in general kind of art and predictions, and that's a very interesting question to try to think for future. So the responsibility of revenue management is to predict who wants to fly and use that information, combining with information about money that passenger will bring to create an optimal availability of seats. Under the assumption that it maximizes revenue, of course. And now that a hard party, of course, that forecasting of demand has become a huge challenge. From the next short period, obviously, demand will be low. And you may think that there is nothing to do for revenue management perspective, and it may mean that a flight should be opened and we should take whatever demand we can get. In reality, that's not even the key. This time, revenue managers should be more attentive than ever, and I would like to highlight some, I think, 3 main points considering this question.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that the first and very important point is fair monitoring. Market changes dramatically, and we can't precisely predict what situation will be on each particular route. Not in general innovation, but on each particular route. So in case if carriers are reoriented to domestic market, we can face overcapacity and fares go down. In opposite situation, when some of carriers would stop flight operations and we face the reduction of capacity, fares go up, of course, in case of total demand recovery. And this is going to take a lot of analysis in reality. Analysts should focus on it and create fair structure that is in place with the network, taking into account current situation market, competition strategy, and their reactions will help to be successfully competitive. The second point is work with availability of seats in RBD. If you change your strategy of pricing, it may need to evaluate availability, of course. Availability should be changed according to the company strategy. I have mentioned the company strategy already. The right availability should be achieved for the airline's load factor or revenue plan. For example, if airline is going to buy back market share, increase load factor, you have to make sure that the availability is more open. So both combining your company strategy and your personal experience on how each particular route can perform are significant. And the last point, of course, but not least, is forecasting. That is what we need to work a lot with. Nevertheless, revenue management system optimization perhaps is not used now. Preserve data quality as much as possible is a point of high priority for future. As you know, forecasting and revenue management system are based on historical data. That data is now highly volatile. All current flights affect data in revenue management system, which will be used for forecasting in future. So revenue manager must not let this data affect on forecast badly and determine what data is useful for it and what data is not. Okay, anyway, it takes time to build new forecast models after COVID-19. Nobody waits that industry will recover immediately, so demand fluctuation may be continuing next 2 years approximately, I think. It takes time to let your system to learn again. What kind of data you will use during this period depends only on you. Whether it will previous year demand data or last 2 or 3 weeks. Anyway, the only way to manage forecast after COVID-19 is carefully monitoring of booking activity and being ready to react immediately to unpredictable deviations in the forecasts. Thank you.
Sure, sure. Thank you so much, Oksana. That was really helpful. And, I really quickly wanted to inform everyone that looking at the popular demand, because we have a lot of questions coming in, we'll be extending this webinar by 10 to 15 minutes because, you guys definitely don't want to miss what Lufthansa Consulting, Arvind and Nadine has to cover, which is really informative and important for you guys to listen to. So coming to you, Arvind and Nadine, as you guys consult a lot of airlines, I'm sure today you've heard a lot of interesting insights from all our panelists, as well as, we've been seeing a lot of interest coming in from our attendees. So I wanted to ask you both, if there is a roadmap for airlines to follow, for within the situation. Arvind, if you can maybe talk more about it.
Sure. Thanks, Shweta. We've had some very interesting points come through from the other panelists as well. And I think it's helpful to step back and bring that all into a unifying view of day one. But what's really important to understand is that day one, there's no one universal day one. It's really different for each airline. When we talk to our clients, they don't ask us what's the big picture of when things will come back, when will demand recover for us, what routes can we launch first, what will our yields look like, and so on. And the interesting thing is, this is true even for airlines within a single market. And it's driven by many different factors, only some of which are actually controllable by the airline themselves. If we look at what's on the screen now, the 4 elements on the left are some of those things which are environmental or external factors for airlines, where they may have little or no ability to directly control that and would be mostly reactive. Travel restrictions, customer sentiment, which we've touched upon many times, especially in terms of health, safety, needing a certain amount of reassurance, regulatory requirements, especially if there are things like necessarily having to keep a free middle seat empty has big implications, and just the underlying organic demand profile that you can expect given changes in the macroeconomic situation and so on. So these are some of the elements that airlines would largely be reacting to at a market level. But then the other set of elements that impact how an airline would deal with this is what you see on the right, which is really the internal or the airline specific factors, what their core markets are in terms of which geographies they serve. Very importantly, the customer segments, especially as you think of business versus VFR versus leisure, and how each of those would come back at different rates over the next few years. Certainly the scale of operations, like we saw in the case of China, as well, a large global hub carrier is going to have a very different approach to how they manage this and what their recovery would be as compared to a more localized domestic operator. And finally, just the underlying business model, whether you're a premium carrier chasing a certain type of customer and certain type of route versus an LCC who maybe has a greater ability to stimulate demand in certain ways. So there's a mix of these factors that need to flow into how an airline thinks about what its day one is and how it would approach that.
Right. And Arvind, how this would vary for different airlines in the same market? Are there any examples you can talk about?
Well, we've seen a couple of examples from China that Landy presented. If you look at India, for example, AirAsia India, typical LCC model, high density narrow bodies connecting a certain type of route network versus Vistara, which has a different type of route network, a more premium configuration, international flights, and now the 787s that they need to find a way to deploy profitably. So the challenges that each of them are facing are very different, and how they would bring back capacity into the market in a way that works for them would be very different. We can also look at the Middle East, for example, Emirates, Etihad, Qatar, broadly similar concept in terms of being global super connectors, but with slightly different focuses in terms of the types of markets they fly to and connect, and certainly a difference in fleet. Emirates is going to have to find a way to fill in all wide body fleet in some way over the next 2 years. So that's how you can find differences even within the market.
Sure.
And the thing is, frankly, independent of who you are as an airline, though, you should be planning right now, thinking ahead for day one. And actually, if you could go to the next slide, please. Nobody really knows what the future is going to look like, as we've mentioned a few times on this panel, but there are some basic working assumptions we can start with, at least for the very initial restart, the new normal, as we call it. In the interest of time, I won't go into all of these elements, but I'd like to highlight just 2 of them, because they're particularly important as you think about the scenarios and so on. The first is the top left, the focus on basic hygiene and health. Customers are going to want to have a certain amount of reassurance that it will be safe and secure for them to fly with you. On the other hand, the airlines also, of course, would want to protect their crew, their employees, and their passengers. And that is going to translate into a number of changes. It could be seats, it could be onboard service, catering, as well as on the ground in terms of the airport processes, because you're going to have social distancing and so on. That has implications in terms of processing times, turnaround times, and so on, which really need to be thought through a little bit as you think of how you plan for the future. The second element I'd like to just highlight out of these is the different competitive landscape. There will be winners and losers from this. Unfortunately, in just the last 3 days, we've got bad news from South Africans, from Virgin Australia, and from Norwegian, at least a couple of their subsidiaries. So the future will look different in certain markets. There will be fewer players possibly. And that means that you have an opportunity to, if you survive, to build that into your plan and perhaps leverage that and come out of it stronger. So really taking into account some of these different things that are likely to be realities on day one is important as you plan for that. And speaking of planning then, we see it as really 3 big things that airlines should be doing right now at a high level. And the first is, much like Payal mentioned earlier, rigorously plan your scenarios. Really think about all of the different ways this could go, all of the contributing factors, and keep revisiting that to ensure that you are up to date and keeping as relevant as possible. What's very important is the data that feeds into it. And it's more than just your traditional data sources. Thinking out of the box helps. For example, we're talking to clients about tracking COVID infection rates in markets that are of interest to them to get a sense of when demand, as a forward indicator of demand returning, or looking at Google search trends to see if there's customer sentiment building back for holidays and travel in certain markets. Things of that sort need to be done. Second is cross-functional coordination. Oksana mentioned quite importantly that you need to work along with all of the other commercial functions. This includes bringing in the ops functions as well, because they need to ensure the aircraft are brought out of storage with the right aircraft at the right time to be able to service the fleet, and the supply chain comes in. In general, by this time, every airline should have a cross-functional team that is actively looking at future scenarios and planning for that. If there's an airline which has not done that yet, it's high time they started doing that. Finally, just touching on the finances, because demand is not going to come bouncing back anytime soon. Volumes will be low. Right out of the gate, airlines are going to continue to be under cash pressure. And that means using the time now to really take a very, very hard look at your fixed cost base and see what you can do to bring that down to a slightly more manageable level, as well as arranging short-term financing so that once there's a resumption of service, you can really ride out that initial rough period and hopefully get going beyond that point.
Sure. Thanks, Arvind. As the next step, Nadine, we would like to understand the corresponding preparations and actions required for the commercial functions. Since we have a lot of commercial attendees here, in this crisis recovery. So basis your experience, Nadine, what does this mean for the commercial strategy of an airline? What should be what what should the objective be for the key commercial functions within the airlines?
Well, thank you very much, Shweta. So to begin with, it's important to highlight that the success of the commercial actions depend very strongly on alignment with fleet and network. Payal has explained that very much into depth. So both network and fleet here lay the foundation for the commercial strategy and also determine the actions of the key commercial functions on a common timeline, but also on targets. So let's have a look at the objectives of the key commercial functions, as you can see on the bubbles. So revenue management, pricing, product and ancillaries, customer experience, sales, distribution, and marketing. So depending on the airline model, as some airlines manage it either jointly or separately, revenue management and pricing have to work on a common approach and have to be aligned. So the significant change compared to pre-crisis is that a lot of the variables changed in the equation to forecast and also to steer future demand. So therefore the data analysis and also the decision have to be taken on a different basis. For the forecast, well, besides the cleaning of data due to capacity changes, it's also very important to take context-specific data into consideration, such as macroeconomic trends, customer sentiments, but also travel bans. So for the inventory steering side, it is vital to manage the short term and the long term differently. So here really adjusting the setup carefully for the flights further out is vital for the airline's revenue. So we have now end of April and it's a fast changing environment. So it's really essential to protect the yield further out for special events such as Christmas coming up. For the flights closer in, so here's also, where Oksana already mentioned, this agile approach is very significant. And real-time dashboards play here a very important role. For the sales and distribution side, they should follow a very well-mapped out communication strategy that is really in line with the customer needs for flexibility, but also for using the most cost-effective distribution channels. If we have now a next look at the ancillary and product side, so introducing further ancillaries is not only increasing customer choices, but also recover revenue. So here, options to sell would be, for example, travel insurances, as well as to explore opportunities for B2B ancillaries. And we heard earlier also the topic on the free neighbor seats, so more space on the plane. Other option could be, for example, the sleeper's couch and another type of seat format. For the customer experience side, so here really it has to ensure that the customer trust rises quickly after the crisis. So by adapting safety concerns and also to the customer sentiments towards health is really essential. So options to increase safety measures, some airlines already took it, but in general, like health checks, wearing of masks, and also the cleaning measures. And finally, the last bubble was marketing and communication. Well, they really have to pay attention to the customer needs and react towards their worries and fears. So knowing that the customer wants to travel, but is worried to travel. So therefore, it's really important to showcase health measures that could help around to turn the negative into a positive experience and to generate confidence into booking future trips again.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nadine. I think that was really helpful. Some good insights from you on the revenue management side. And how do you need to adapt your revenue management strategy? What factors do you think play a major role there?
Mm-hmm. So here, market-specific modification of the revenue management strategy are really essential to react to the fast-changing environment. There are two ways airlines reacted most common pre-crisis. So either going after volume with lower yields or going after higher yields with lower load factors. So the question is really if this strategy is still valid, as low fares might not stimulate demand anymore, and maybe other factors play a role. So therefore, testing the price elasticity of the individual markets, as well as understanding market-specific changes based on the crisis recovery stages is really crucial. And of course, it has to be monitored very carefully, and adaptation need to follow very precise and fast.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for that, Nadine and Arvind. I'm sure today we've helped industry professionals understand a framework for recovery. And now we are going to open the panel for questions. I'm going to talk about the first question which we have. We have a question from Siddharth Kinney. In a normal scenario, airlines have payload restrictions in place. In the new normal scenario, do we see airlines introducing restrictions at the outset in order to adapt to the evolving dynamics and be able to better manage demand bookings that would come in closer to the travel date? Pyle, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I've understood the question correctly, I think we are trying to understand if we can kind of predict and save seats for the high yield traffic by taking proactive load restrictions or lid restrictions. I think that would be very difficult in current scenario because there is expected to be a lot of fluctuation in demand. I think, and Oksana has kind of also covered it, to take care of last minute demand or to adapt to the changes, you really need involvement of the analysts. So instead of focusing on lid restrictions to ensure that you are saving enough for the last minute or, taking care of that, you would want to get your analysts to get more involved with it. I mean, I don't see people making or putting load restrictions, because ultimately there is a possibility of merging flights, merging demand at the last minute. So I don't see a scenario where people, unless mandated, will have load restrictions.
Sure. Thank you, Payal. We have actually a list of questions. There are many, but I'm just picking a couple here which we can address. The next question is for Arvind. Arvind, apart from possible consolidations and M&A activities on the airline landscape in the near future, could a new airline business model emerge from the current COVID-19 crisis? And this question is from Linus Burr.
Hi, Linus. That's a very interesting question. I think there will be some changes to how airlines or airline groups view their business, especially in the short to mid-term. We've spoken about some of the near-term impacts and that they might skew more towards cargo, more aggressively chase that business. We've had a lot of interesting conversations with our clients about how they can have now a proper strategy for the cargo business, because earlier it was just an add-on to passenger, or how they can leverage their MRO facilities, for example, to become a third-party MRO player, since they don't have enough activity on their own anymore. So there will be some changes in terms of how the airline modifies its focus a little bit away from the pure passenger business focus. From a point of view of larger business models, I think we may see more partnerships between airlines and less direct competition to avoid everybody bleeding. Possibly partnerships with regional airlines. So you have a long haul flying into a particular location where the regional airline is a little bit stronger to carry onward traffic. So we'll see some modifications of that sort within airlines or airline groups, whether they will, and of course, possibly charter business in the near term being much higher. Whether we'll see a completely new business model emerge out of all of this, to be honest, I'm not quite sure, but if you have any ideas and if you have any investors, do let me know.
Okay, thank you. Another question, unfortunately, we don't have the name, but that's for Landy. Can selective fare increases on high demand routes help the recovery process, especially where competition has reduced due to some airlines being grounded due to the crisis?
Well, during the pandemic, we have seen a few markets showing a high one-way demand, especially from the high impacted area to less impacted area. But overall, I think in China, there are two situations. The first is if there's a competition, normally it will be pretty much the same for all the airlines. Unless you are a low-cost carrier, you may have lower costs, so you may suspend less flights than the legacy airlines. The second situation is there are some airlines, for example, the China Express, as I mentioned in my section, they are operating some uniquely operate flights, routes. There is no competition. So in that competitions, in that roads, they do recover faster. So I think if you can operate some roads with less competition, that will help with the recovery.
Sure. Great. Great. I think looking at the time, we'll just cover one last question. That's for Payal. Payal, what new value propositions can airline offer? The question is from Nirosh Azi.
I think what the airlines need to start focusing on is what are the things that are concerning consumers when it comes to flying. Anything that can get the consumer on board, make him more comfortable. I think those are the themes or value propositions that one needs to look at. Like I said, even in India, airlines have always had rescheduling products, but now if you see, those products are available on OTAs as well. Traditionally they were only available on their own websites. So for example, rescheduling flexibility seems to be one of the products at competitive prices. I think as we evolve, we'll figure out what kind of value proposition what exact products need to be offered. But I think the key theme here is, how do you get people to travel again once crisis kind of subdues and operations start again? So there are two challenges. One is, when do we start, and the other is, when we start, how do we get people to fly? And I think that's what one needs to think. And again, you can go to Google Trends, you can figure out what are the major concerns you are getting from customers. If you have some feedback from the call centers, stay on top of that. But I would say it's slightly difficult right now to give the exact value propositions, but the key theme is going to be how to get people to fly.
Great. Great. Thank you so much, Payal. I know we couldn't cover all the questions today looking at the time, but we'll be conducting a series of webinar. So I'm sure we'll be covering most of the questions in the coming webinar. And, I would like to thank everyone today who joined us, and of course, all our panelists for really, talking about some great insights which would help the industry. I also want to highlight that Radian is also running an industry-wide initiative to provide free consulting sessions to anyone who needs help with building the right strategy to deal with the challenges of today and work towards a better tomorrow. Thank you so much. Looking at this slide which you see, we'll definitely see the planes in the sky very soon. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.